So let me begin with a story, an anecdote. About 14 years ago, I was working in Bangkok, and I was given the duty one day of administering an oral examination to a largish group of Thai school leavers. Most of the children I was testing were very much the standard you'd expect. They were coming out on the British Council scale around band 4 or 5. They could use English, but they were rather hesitant. They made some grammar mistakes. Their pronunciation was rather heavily influenced by Thai, and so they did tend to leave off an awful lot of final consonants. They perhaps had rather limited vocabulary, but at least they were using English. But then one student came along who was different. He understood everything I said. He spoke with great confidence and fluency in an almost perfect accent. There were hardly any grammar mistakes in his speech. What made him different? I was puzzled. I looked at his form, his candidate form, to see if he'd filled in yes to the question visits abroad. But no, they said none. So he hadn't lived in an English-speaking country. So I asked him, who were your teachers, thinking that he must have been at a school that had a particularly talented native speaker on the staff. My teachers, he said? My teachers were Richard Burton, Laurence Olivier, Vivian Lee, and Gregory Peck. He was a cinema buff and watched movies with that kind of empathy that led him to imitate the behavior of the screen heroes and screen heroines, and that included their language behavior. He did slightly spoil the effect, I remember, at the end of the interview, because when I told him it was over and he could leave, he said, "Could I ask you one question, sir?" "Yes," I said. "Tell me, sir," he said, "am I sailing through?" So he had the language, but he didn't have all of the pragmatics. Well, I suppose a naive reaction to a success story like this might be to say, well, school language classes are useless. Let's instead send all our children to the cinema. So that would be one reaction, but I think perhaps a more sensible reaction would be to notice that what distinguished this particular pupil was enthusiasm. His love, in his case, not so much of English as of some uses of English, which had made English for him a kind of hobby. He'd got hooked. It wasn't just a subject, it was a hobby. Once you've harnessed that kind of enthusiasm and alertness, openness to a subject, then you don't really have any problem of how to teach it. It gets learned. And indeed, the quality of the teacher and the materials then almost ceases to matter. But the hooking has to come first. And I think there are many teachers who might be rather uncomfortable to have that student in their class. It is usually unpleasant when your class does not learn what you teach them. But it may be just as disturbing when they learn what you don't teach them. But of course there's bound to be a mismatch between what is taught and what is learned. I'm using learning for the time being in a general sense. I'm not distinguishing learning from acquisition. If there wasn't this mismatch, if you could only learn what had been taught to you, then all education would be a continuous process of attrition. We would learn less and less with each succeeding generation, because of course teachers can't pass on 100% of what they know. But what we know about language is probably not even describable. We couldn't even state it in finite terms by putting it down in the form of explicit rules, explicit statements. I'd like to try a little experiment to illustrate this. Imagine you're doing a grammar exercise, straightforward sentence transformation task. Have you got a pen, piece of paper, everybody? I'm going to give you a little task to carry out, just one item, and I want you to do it without giving it very much conscious thought. Just write down the most natural response that comes into your head. Don't agonize over it. And so the task is, make this sentence singular. There's the sentence, they write books. I want you to make it singular. They write books. Okay, no agonizing, no agonizing. Have you done it? Okay, let's, can we see the rest of the... Move it up a bit. Right, I expect some of you did exactly what I asked. You wrote down, without too much thought, she's writing a book, or he's writing a book. I expect some others of you wrote down, she writes a book, with some hesitation, crossed it out, tried his writing, crossed that out. You weren't quite sure what I wanted. You were worried because it would seem to be an automatic task, and yet your first response to it didn't perhaps quite sound right. Yet I hadn't told you to do anything with the verb aspect. If you did it, if you produced the first sentence, she's writing a book, you did it automatically. Of course, there's also the problem whether you regard the singular of they as he or she. I'm married to a textbook writer. I tend to think of it as that the writing of books is something that goes with she, myself. So that's the problem. Could we see the second time? So if we look at those four possible sentences, she writes books, she's writing a book, she writes a book, she's writing books. They're all four grammatical, but there's a difference. The first two, it seems to me, are fairly natural, unmarked sentences. The third and the fourth would have to be justified by creating a rather elaborate frame of context. Now, you could think this up. I've thought of a couple here. For number 3, for example, here's my context for this one. She keeps getting divorced, yet she still manages to look cheerful. How does she do it? Oh, that's easy. Every time she ditches a husband, she writes a book. And for sentence number 4, Sally used to go to the bridge club regularly, but she's given that up. She's writing books instead. So, what exactly is happening there? Why is it that 1 and 2 are, in some sense, natural, normal, and 3 and 4 are, in some sense, rather unusual? Well, I think if you want a linguistic explanation, you could perhaps give one like this. Let's say there's a semantic feature which is plus or minus specific. And that semantic feature can apply to both verb phrase and noun phrase. A noun phrase with a can certainly be either, I'm looking for a little girl, have you seen her? That's plus specific, even though it's minus definite. I'm looking for a little girl, have you seen one? That's minus specific and minus definite. So we can have either plus or minus specific with an indefinite article, but it defaults to plus specific. In other words, if there's nothing in the context to suggest minus, we expect plus. In other words, we think that the speaker has in mind one particular example of what he's talking about. So she's writing a book is plus specific. We're thinking of a particular book, unless we know we can't be. And the same, whereas the unmarked plural, books, will usually default to minus specific, books in general. The same thing applies to the verb aspect. Continuous verb, is writing, defaults to plus specific. When we say is writing, we tend to think of particular act of writing, unless it's excluded for some reason. And the simple present, writes, defaults to minus specific. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you made that analysis or even if you understood it. What matters is that if you're a competent speaker of English, you instinctively would have chosen the right form there. How did you do it? Nobody taught you. That ain't in the grammar books. It's not in the textbooks as a rule. If textbooks were to go down to this kind of detail, they'd weigh a ton and cost a fortune. And perhaps it's worth stressing about textbooks. One thing I haven't heard many people mention this week, but I think is true, is that one problem with textbooks is that they are necessarily meagre. They don't contain enough of the language to allow you to learn everything that you are eventually going to learn. The quantity of teaching they contain is insufficient. And as managers of learning, then, one of our jobs is to make sure that we open windows on a wider world of language for acquisition.